Hello, I'm Attorney Todd Leneve. Welcome to West Virginia Gun Law. Today I want to talk to you about concealed carry in United States postal facilities. Stick around. So I'm periodically asked about concealed carry in a post office, and it seems that there's a lot of misunderstanding of what the law really is. I'll also hear discussions of this in concealed carry classes, in other firearms training courses, and there is a broad range of opinions that people have about the legality of carrying into a post office. And so my hope today was to spend a little time and clear that up so that you understand how the law applies when it comes to concealed carry in a post office. And let me just jump to the bottom line right up front here, and that is that as of right now, you cannot legally carry a concealed firearm into a postal facility. Now, post offices are federal properties, federal facilities, and for as long as I can remember, they have been protected under the prohibition against carrying a firearm into a federal property. And so what that means is that you can't enter the grounds of a postal facility with that firearm because that currently is prohibited as it is a federal facility. Again, just because it's your local post office doesn't mean that it's not a federal facility and that it's not protected by that current federal prohibition. Now, that's not to say that I personally believe that it should be a protected place. And we're going to talk about some things here today that suggest that there are some successful challenges that have occurred, and there are some challenges coming that I think probably do have a good chance of being looked at favorably. So let's take a minute and break this down. On June 18th, 2024, as of the time that this video is released just a few days ago, the Firearms Policy Coalition, Second Amendment Foundation, and two named individual plaintiffs filed federal civil litigation in the Northern District of Texas, seeking to advance a Second Amendment challenge against the prohibition to carry firearms onto postal facilities. Now, it's important that we look at this and understand as a civil challenge, this is the kind of thing that is similar in nature to the bump stock litigation, pistol brace litigation, 80% lowers litigation, those kinds of cases where it's not that somebody got in trouble criminally to begin the litigation, but rather a group of people said, hey, we will be affected by enforcement of these unfair rules and laws, and so we're asking a court to examine the issue from a Second Amendment basis and make a determination of whether or not these laws are constitutional. Ultimately, depending on the outcome of the case, if it goes favorably, once it makes its way to the United States Supreme Court, this is the kind of litigation that could result in the prohibition against carrying firearms into postal facilities being stricken down nationwide, meaning everybody everywhere would be protected by the Second Amendment if they chose to carry into a postal facility. So this is an interesting piece of litigation that I think it's about time has been filed. Now, if we go back a little bit to January of this year, 2024, we have an example of a case in which a gentleman was criminally charged for having a firearm on the grounds of a postal facility in Florida. He ended up being indicted in federal court and had to face two separate criminal charges. First count was a felony for bringing a firearm onto the grounds of a federal facility. The second count was for forcibly resisting arrest. So that case is known as the United States of America versus Emmanuel Ayala, A-Y-A-L-A. And Mr. Ayala in fact, was an employee of the United States Postal Service. In his job, Mr. Ayala drove an 18-wheeler for the post office, out of a mail facility in Florida. And while he operated the 18-wheeler, he carried a concealed handgun in a fanny pack that he wore while he drove for the purpose of personal protection. Mr. Ayala had a lawful concealed carry permit issued by the state of Florida, so he wasn't doing anything wrong other than this made-up ban against carrying a firearm on postal facilities. So it was known by some that he carried a handgun, and some do-gooder decided to alert the Office of Inspector General within the Postal Department. They conducted an investigation, and ultimately 2 agents came to the facility location where Mr. Ayala worked and subsequently tried to arrest him. Well, when they tried to arrest him, he fled them, got away, and was later arrested, and then subsequently was indicted, again for those 2 separate counts. Shortly after his indictment, Mr. Ayala filed a motion to dismiss both counts of the indictment against him, and those challenges centered on the Second Amendment and his legal right to be able to protect himself by carrying a concealed firearm. So initially the U.S. government filed a response. It was apparently a very perfunctory couple paragraph response that the trial judge said, hey, this is useless for anybody. It doesn't help in any way whatsoever. I'm instructing the parties to file extensive briefs, and she set out a briefing schedule and specifically noted that she wanted to see a Second Amendment analysis in light of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the case that came out of New York and ultimately was resolved by the United States Supreme Court back in 2022. This was a landmark case that really reevaluated how courts will look at and analyze legal challenges to the Second Amendment based on a standard of looking at the history and tradition of firearms laws at the time of the founding of the country and the creation of the Second Amendment. So ultimately, the parties briefed the issue, and the judge issued an opinion back in January this year that was just fantastic, really well written, very thorough, long opinion. I've read a couple of times, and it is just full of tremendous analysis and breakdown of the law as it applies to prohibiting the presence of firearms on a postal facility. So I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on the opinion just because it is so long, and I want to keep the point of this pretty straightforward. However, I'll say that the judge did a fantastic job in reviewing the evidence, reviewing the historical standards, and she ultimately concluded that there was not a sufficient historical standard that would prevent the possession of a firearm in a postal facility at the time of the founding of the nation, such that the current prohibition could be upheld as the basis to charge Mr. Ayala criminally for having had a firearm concealed on his person while he was on the grounds of the facility where he worked. Ultimately, she dismissed that count of the indictment against him because that analysis was a strictly legal analysis. There wasn't any factual dispute about the circumstances of that case. And the way trial courts work in this country is that the trial judge is empowered to make determinations about issues of law. This particular challenge under the Second Amendment that Mr. Ayala brought up was in fact a legal analysis challenge. So she was able to make a determination on his case and ultimately dismiss that criminal charge. The separate charge of forcibly resisting arrest is a factual issue. And again, the way our trial courts work in this country, a judge is not permitted to make determinations of fact because that's the sole province of a jury. And so she couldn't dismiss the case because a jury would have to hear those arguments. So that part of the case continued, but the charge of having brought a firearm onto a federal facility was dismissed because, again, the judge said there's no historical basis for excluding firearms on postal facility grounds. So again, I'm not going to dig deep into the opinion, but there were a couple of things that I pulled out of this that I want to show you here that I believe are very telling of the judge's overall thought process and the way she viewed the arguments and the law as it applied in this case. Let's take a look at those real quickly. In sum, 2 founding-era state governments prohibited individuals from carrying during legislative sessions or at polling places. The lone polling place restriction applied only on election day and only at the polls. Likewise, the lone legislative restriction did not extend beyond an active session. Accepting these as part of the historical traditions of firearms regulation, the record demonstrates a very limited principle. Firearms regulation may be permissible in places to prohibit intimidation or interference with important and legally definitive government decisions. But such regulations are inarguably limited to occasions where important and final governmental decisions are made. Thus, a blanket restriction on firearms possession in post offices is incongruent with the American tradition of firearms regulation. So again, this is what we call an as-applied case, meaning it only applies to the individual currently affected, Mr. Ayala. It does not apply to anybody else. So the fact that it ruled in Mr. Ayala's favor doesn't mean that it's okay for you to go carry into a postal facility now. You certainly could do so. You certainly could run the risk of being arrested and indicted, and you certainly could use the same rationale to argue that you shouldn't have been charged. But I'm not sure about you. I don't want to be the one who has to go through that process just to make the point when we've got Firearms Policy Coalition, Second Amendment Foundation, and a couple of individuals who have said, hey, we're going to tackle this head on through the civil courts, and through that civil court process, we're going to see if we can't get this blanket prohibition struck down nationwide. So stick around and watch for this one. We're going to be doing updates as anything relevant occurs. And certainly I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about the process here in the meantime. Feel free to leave a comment down below, get some discussion started. And of course, as always, you're welcome to give me a call or contact me through email via the information on my website, which is linked in the description down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, we'd love to have you do so. Please consider that. Hit the like button, share this video with your friends. Let's get the information out there, and let's try to get ahead of the anti-2A algorithm that seems to stifle these videos so that they're not seen by as many people as could see them. Again, I appreciate you being here. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care and be safe.